Welcome to the tutorial how to add effects to your scene. In this tutorial, I'm going to go over the effects in general and then touch upon some specific effects, namely the cutter, the tone, and the color override effects. But before we begin, I'd like to let you know about some corrections that I made. In the scene setup video tutorial, I staggered all the elements in the background here. So all of the elements are still staggered along the z-axis, but they all now exist behind our central character. So to begin, let's start with looking at the module library, and this tab is by default located behind the timeline tab. So if we click on that, we bring up the module library, and right here on the far left side of the module library is what's known as the module library view toolbar. And there are three tools in that toolbar, three icons in that toolbar. The first one is what allows you to view all the effects as icons in the various tabs. So if we click on these little gray rectangles with white titles on them, you can see that there are various tabs that house different types of modules, and they're grouped in certain ways. So obviously the 3D and the deformation relate to those processes. The group relates to modules that are involved in grouping, particles with particle effects. In the Move tab, you would see things like the peg, the quad map, things like that you would use to move elements, etc. And the two most important being the All Modules, which lists all of the effects in alphabetical order, as well as the favorites. So let's go back and look at the module library toolbar here. I didn't finish with that. The second button is to view as list. So if you click on this, you can view all the items of a given tab in alphabetical order by name and then with a small description of what it does, which can be useful if you're wondering what a specific effect does. Then the last one is to view as icon with names. So you get the icon, you get the name, and then you get the description as well. But let's go back to the default to view as icons. So as I was saying, the favorites tab is a good one because it houses the most often used modules, so the composites, the peg, the right module, the camera, adding a color card which adds a solid background, etc. But what you can also do is add any other effect module from a different tab to the favorites tab. And the easiest way to do this is to go into one of the other sections of the interface to add a second version of the module library. Then to go to a place where you can select a different module. Say for example you use the multi-port out all the time. So what you can do is select the multi-port out module from the groups tab and then drag it over the favorites tab, and you'll see that that green circle with the white plus sign appears, which lets you know that you're then able to release your mouse in order to drop that effect into the favorites tab. So now the multi-port out is in the favorites tab, and if you decide later on that your favorites tab is too cluttered, you simply need to select any effects module that you no longer want in this tab and then hit the delete button. So let's just close that. So something to know about the effects modules is that they always need a drawing connection. For example, I can't just drop a blur effect into my network viewer, into my scene. The software will wonder what it is that I want to be blurred. So if I want to blur, say, these rocks, for example, I would have to attach this rock drawing layer to the effects module in order for these rocks to be blurred. If I want everything in the scene to be blurred, that's fine. But then I would need to plug all those different elements into the blur module. The other thing that effects modules sometimes need are matte layers as well. So a matte is something that will define the area where the effect will be applied. And when you create a matte, the software doesn't consider the color or the details of that matte. What it's really looking for is the outer shape as well as the transparency of the matte. And this will become more clear as we go through a few examples. So let's do that. Let's start with the cutter effect. And what I'm going to cut out, in fact, are the character's eyes. So let's click somewhere here in the camera view and then zoom in. And really close in on the character's eyes so we can see what we're doing. Then in the network view, let's go into our hero master group. And in fact, I'm going to expand the network view so that we can maneuver in it a little bit more easily. And let's look for the head group again, and then the facial features group. And here we have our two eyes. So let's start with the left eye. I'm going to enter that group, and we can see here that we have the eye, which if you remember, and I can select the transform tool and then select the peg to make it obvious. So the eye is actually the white of the eye. So not the iris and the pupil, but the white along with the black outline of the white of the eye. And if we select the pupil, you'll see it really is the iris and the pupil. And of course, the peg for the eye moves both the pupil and the eye because we want them to be moved together. So the reason that I would like to apply a cutter effect to the eyes is that when I move the iris and the pupil, say, upwards to make the character look like he's looking up, or downwards to make him look like he's looking down, all of the entire pupil and iris is exposed, which of course looks anatomically speaking unrealistic. So for example, if I grab the pupil peg and I pull it upwards, you'll see that the eye is outside of the white but into the skin of the face, so that doesn't look real. What would look more realistic is if all of this part was hidden, the top part of the iris and the pupil. So we're going to use the cutter effect to make that happen. The first thing I'm going to do is from the favorites tab, I'm going to grab a composite and drag and drop that into the left eye group in the network view, and then I'm going to do the same with this cutter. So I'm going to plug both the left pupil and the left eye into the composite, and then plug the composite into the multi-port out, and then click on this little yellow box here on the composite to bring up the layer properties of the composite, and I'm going to change the mode from bitmap to pass-through. And once again, that's so that we can manipulate the different composited elements still as unflattened vector elements. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to exit the group and go up one group level. So that's back inside the facial features. And you can see that there's a new out port that's been created. And so what I'm going to do is unplug what used to be the ports for the eye, the whites of the eye, and the pupil and iris that was coming out. And now we just have the one for the composite, which composites both those elements. And I'm going to plug that into the composite for the facial features. And then I'm going to go back into the left eye group. So as I was mentioning before, some effect modules need mats as well as drawing layers attached to them. So the element that we would like cut out, so to speak, is the pupil, because as it looks up or down, part of it's going to disappear. So part of it will be cut out. But the mat that we want to create, so in other words, the area that will define where it's visible and where it will suddenly become partially not visible, is the white of the eye. And in fact, it's not all of the white of the eye, because it doesn't include this black line. It really is just the white of the eye. So I'll show you what I mean. I'm just going to move the pupil up. I'm going to use the Option button if you're using Mac, or the Alt button if you're using Windows, to pass the cutter module through. So the drawing that we would like to get cut by the module goes into the right port of the cutter effect, whereas the mat goes into the left. So now what we need to do is create the mat. If we select the hero left eye module and we go to the drawing view, you'll see that it looks like this. So that's almost pretty much what we need. The reason that we don't copy and paste in the network view is because then you create a clone of the module and not a copy. And what a clone is, if we actually do that, we copy and then we paste, means that if I do something to one, it'll happen in the other. So for example, if I suddenly make this my mat, and I go to the color view, and I decide that I want my mat to be this fluorescent green, I can create a new color, double click on it to rename it, and let's make the alpha 255 to make it 100% solid. And then I paint my entire element green, if I then go back to the camera view, you'll see that the eye is green. So what happened is that both these elements, both the left eye and this other left eye, so we can rename this matte just so it's clear. So both the matte and the hero eye are now green because they're clones. So if I make a change on one, a change will occur on the other one. So that's why we don't copy and paste in the network view. So what's the other way that we can do this? Well, let's just undo those changes so our eye is, as we can see, white again. Let's delete this matte layer that we created. So what we want to do instead is go to the view menu for the network view and select Insert Element, or you can use the keyboard shortcut Command R on Mac or Control R on Windows. And let's name this one iMatte. You can plug it in here. Let's go back to our hero eye layer, go back to the drawing view, use the select tool to select the entire element, use Command C or Control C if you're using Windows to copy it, go to our iMatte layer and paste. And now what we can do is paint the matte green again, so we can make the whole thing green, and I'll show you what we don't want. So I'm just going to make this whole thing green to show you another wrong example. And now if we go to the network view, the last thing we want to do is we want to connect the iMatte to the iPeg, and we want to go into the cutter module and use inverted. So let me explain both of those things. So let's move this down so it all becomes a little bit easier to see. Okay, so the reason that we want the iMatte connected to the iPeg is because we want it to move around with everything else. We want it to have the same position information as everything else. If it wasn't connected to this peg, then if we move the entire character in a certain direction, or we move the eye in a certain direction, this matte will be left behind. So we need to connect it to something that controls position information, and ideally that's the same thing that controls the position information to what it's covering as the matte. So this eye is exactly identical to this eye, so they should move together. They should define that space together. The second thing I did is I went into the cutter layer properties and I selected inverted, because if we didn't do that, then what the matte is defining is the shape, so the pupil will always be invisible or cut out in this shape. But what we want is the opposite. We want it to be cut out or disappear as it exits the shape. So that's why we selected inverted. So now if I select the pupil peg with the transform tool and I drag it upwards in the camera view, you'll see that it's starting to look a little bit like what we want. We want part of it to disappear. The same thing goes for if we want it to move downwards. We want it to disappear as it exits the white of the eye, or as it nears the edge of the white of the eye. But of course, what's happening here is that it's disappearing when it hits the border of the entire shape. So that includes the black line as well as the white of the eye. But we don't want that. We just want it to disappear when it hits the white of the eye. So what we need to do is select our iMatte layer again in the network view, go back to the drawing view, select the select tool, get rid of these lines, and now if we go to the camera view and we do the test one last time, now you can see it's doing what we want. It's hitting the black line and it's disappearing. Like that. So the only issue that we have here now is kind of a picky thing, but if we zoom in even closer, you'll notice that the eye is disappearing when it hits the center of the black line and not when it hits the edge of the black line, and that's because the black line outlining the whites of the eye is a pencil stroke and not a brush stroke. So let me just undo that for a minute. So the only way to really resolve this is if we go into the hero eye layer. Let's go to the drawing view. Let's zoom in. And as you can see here, when it hits the central vector line, that's when it starts to disappear. So what we could do is select these lines, go to the top menu, select Drawing, Convert Pencil Lines to Brush Stroke. Now if we click off, you'll see what we're seeing as what looks like the central vector line is actually the white of the eye. It's this. So that's what we're seeing. But if you just select the outline, you'll see that now it's a solid shape. So if we then delete the white of the eye and then go back to the color view and select eyelid, which is what the fill color was, select the fill tool, and we now fill in the eye once more, and then we go back to the select tool, you'll see that the fill hits the edge of the black outline, and the black outline has its own contour outline. So now we have a brush stroke and a fill that only comes up to the contour of the brush stroke. Let's select the white of the eye, let's copy it. So now if we go back to the network view, let's click on the eye matte layer. Let's click somewhere in the camera view. Let's delete the eye matte. Then let's paste the new one in. Let's go to the color view and select the matte color. And we see that it changes to green. Let's go back to the camera view and let's select the pupil with the transform tool. And now finally, as we move the eye up, it disappears at the right spot. And we can do the same thing if the character is looking down. It disappears when it hits the black line. So I hope that wasn't overly complicated. And I just realized that we didn't really need to do all of that for the hero's left eye. We could have converted the pencil lines to brush strokes just for the eye matte and then use that fill. So it's something to think about when you do it on your own. In addition to that, obviously, we only created a single eye matte drawing for the 3/4 profile view. However, if you create a front view and a profile, you also have to create a drawing 2 and 3 of different eye mattes that match the front and profile view of the left eye. And just like any other drawing in the timeline, you can just call it up in the X sheet or through the data view and bring up eye matte number 2 or eye matte number 3 where appropriate when the character changes its head position. So speaking of the timeline view, let's go there because one thing that we didn't do is extend our matte, which means that if we grab the pupil and move it up like that, it'll only last for 1 frame because if you notice, as soon as we move off frame 1, our eye disappears because the matte hasn't been extended past 1 frame. So let's undo that. And I'm going to select the eye matte in the network view and then click somewhere in the timeline view and then click on the Centron selection button and then do it again. And then I believe I need to click on it one more time. And if we drag this bar towards the right, we can see that the eye matte layer is here and that, yes, of course, it only exists for 1 frame. I'm also going to use the keyboard shortcut 2 to zoom in a bit on the timeline so that you can see the cells a little bit more clearly. So I'm going to go to cell 75, right click on it, and then click Extend Exposure, or once again, you can use the keyboard shortcut F5. So now let's take a look at another effect, that being the tone effect. So I'm going to click on the timeline and use Shift M to reset the view. And what we're going to take a look at is adding a tone to the torso of the character. So right now there's a tone that's been added through painting the torso in 2 colors or 2 tones, but you can actually use an effect to add the tones all over the character, and in that way they can be modified and even animated. A reason that you might want to animate the tone is if, say, the sun is rising or a light suddenly turns on, then the tone can go from being very narrow or very pale to, moving across the body like a shadow, and becoming darker. So there are several different reasons why you might want to animate the tone. So what we're going to do is exit the group in the network view. Actually, let's go straight to the hero master group and let's look for the torso, which is right here. And then let's go to the drawing view and let's reset the view to see it. And then what we're going to do is go to the module library and look for the tone, which will be in the All Modules tab. So let's scroll down toward the letter T, grab it from the All Modules library, and drop it into the network view. So once again, you can see that there are two imports on the tone, which lets us know that there is a mat that is required. So in order to create the mat, let's do what we did before. Let's create another drawing module. This time let's use the keyboard shortcut Control R on Windows or Command R on Mac. And let's name this Torso Tone Mat and say OK. So obviously our torso disappeared here in the drawing view because now we have the blank torso mat selected. So what we're going to do is go to the hero torso layer, use the select tool to grab just this tone part, copy it, and then go to the torso tone mat module and paste it. Then what we're going to do is use the light table so that we can see the entire character, and then use the contour editor to select just the outside points, and then use the arrow key to pull the mat out a little bit, and then maybe get rid of some of these points just to give it a rounder shape. So obviously if you don't already have a tone mat from a character that was previously painted with tone, you're just going to have to draw this yourself using the light table and the drawing tools. You know, something like that. You can always adjust it later or at any time. So let's go to the color view, select our matte color again, select the paint tool, color it green, go back to the network view, select our actual torso layer, let's turn off the light table, let's select the color picker, select the lighter blue color, and if we go to the color view we can see that, and then use the paint tool to paint that in so that the torso is now filled with the same uniform color. So now let's go back to the network view and let's use the keyboard shortcut Option on Mac or Alt on Windows to pass the tone effect through the wire that connects the torso to the composite for the character. And then let's attach the tone mat on the other side, and of course we also need to plug in the torso tone mat to the deformation group so that they both have the same position information and therefore move together. Now let's go back to the camera view and zoom in a bit. And as you can see, a tone has appeared. So this was the old color. It was a dark two-tone, and this has obviously been painted in. But here on our torso, we actually have what the effect is producing, and it looks lighter right now. So let's go into the properties of the tone effect to take a look at what can be modified. So of course you can always change the blur type. With this situation, we want to keep it as radial. The other blur type is directional, and directional is usually used when a character is moving or we want it to look like the blur is coming from a certain direction. If it's an all-around blur, you would keep it as radial. To be able to see the difference between the blur radius, you actually have to go to the render view. So I'm going to click on that. And there you go, you can see the soft blurred edge. So once again, in case you don't remember, the difference between the OpenGL view and the render view is that we work in the OpenGL view, which doesn't show us all of the effects like blurring, for example, because it is vector and not bitmap, and it therefore makes it faster for us to work. When we do a render, we're seeing the bitmap version with all of the effects of what our scene will look like when it's been composited and rendered. So let's change the radius of the blur to something like 5, and we can see immediately that the edge got even softer. You can invert the matte to make the front of the character darker and leave that section untouched. You can use the matte color, which in this case we don't really want because it's kind of that green color, but obviously that can also be useful. If you use the multiplicative, it just makes it even darker because it's multiplying the color. You can change the alpha as well as the color that you want produced. So this doesn't have to be the color of the matte. This is the color that you want the matte to represent, and you can do that by clicking on the alpha. And for example, we can make it very dark. We can take it down again. Right now it's a gray, but we could change the color and see now it looks kind of purple. So clearly all of those things are possible. So I'm going to close that. Let's also go back to the OpenGL view from the render view. And one thing that I forgot to mention, although it may have been obvious from what we see in the camera view, is that even though the torso matte takes on a shape that's larger than the torso, so it comes out past the torso, obviously the drawing that goes into the right port defines the main area where the effect is seen, and then the matte controls where the effect is applied on this drawing. All this to say is that the effect will appear on the overlap section, and if there's any part of the matte that hangs off the edges of the drawing, then that portion is clipped out, and that's what we see because we know the matte is bigger than the torso and extends beyond this line, but that we don't see like a dark patch here beside the torso. And the reason you usually make the matte bigger than the area that it's going to affect is because you don't want there to be like a thin line between the edge of your drawing and the matte that appears because the matte isn't large enough. So I'm just going to collapse little thumbnail views. And now let's talk about how to animate an effect over time. So to do this, let's go to the timeline view. And let's try to find our torso matte. It's selected here in the network view. We'll click once again on the timeline view and then center on selection. So here it is right here. Of course, we didn't extend it, so we should do that as well. There we go. And so in order to be able to animate an effect over time, you have to create a function column for that effect. And we can do that by selecting the tone effect in the timeline view. And in fact, I'm just going to bring the playhead back to frame 1. And then what I'm going to do is create a keyframe on frame 1. And the moment I've created a keyframe, all of a sudden I've created function columns for this effect. So let's go to the white plus sign beside the effect name and click on it. We can see that some of the parameters that we saw in the effects layer properties appear, such as the blur radius, the direction angle, the fall off rate, etc. So what I'm going to do is drag the playhead across to say frame 50 and then create another keyframe there. And then what I'm going to do is double click on the tone to open up the layer properties. And I'm going to click on this button beside the alpha. It's actually a curve, so it brings up the Bezier editor. And from here, I'm going to play a bit with the curve. So this will affect the easing for the way that the effect is animated from frame 0 to frame 50. But not only that, I actually want to change the alpha value. So on frame 50, it's going to be around 110, but on frame 1, I'm going to drag it all the way down here and make it 0. Or actually a faster way, I just realized, is to just type in the value of 0. There we go. So that's a lot easier, and of course the Bezier editor scales properly so that you're able to see your first keyframe and your second keyframe. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to close the Bezier editor. And now if we look in the timeline view, we'll notice that there is no shadow tone, and that's because our alpha is 0. However, if we drag the playhead across, you'll see as it nears frame 50, the shadow suddenly appears. And because I changed that curve from being a completely straight diagonal line to a curve, there's a bit of easing, so it's not mechanical. The shadow doesn't appear at a constant rate. It quickly becomes darker and then sort of plateaus and tapers off in terms of the intensity of the darkness. So let's close the layer properties, and now let's take a look at one last effect, and that's the color override. So in the network view, let's go back to the top, and then in the module library, let's look for the color override. And let's drag and drop it in the network view. I'm just going to raise my hero master group up a bit, and then I'm going to use Alter Option to connect the module between the hero master group and the scene composite. So let's go back to the timeline view, and I'm going to drag the playhead back to frame 1, and let's reset the view so we can see our entire character. And then let's go into the properties of the color override by clicking on the yellow square on the module. So the color override is a pretty powerful effect. You can do many things with it, and I'm only going to touch upon a few of the things that you can do with this effect, but I would strongly urge you to refer to the user guide to look at what else you can do. So first, let's look at the parts of the color override. Here at the top left corner, we have a list of all the palettes in our scene. So we have, once again, that interface palette that's been there since the beginning. We have the pen style opacities that are the textured swatches for the pencil tool. We have our superhero palette, and I actually made a second palette called Superhero Palette Dark, and it's a darker version of all the colors of our superhero. If there's a palette here that you don't see, you can always click on this button here to add a palette to the database, and it will let you browse for another PTL file. So for example, if you had another Harmony scene with a different color palette, you could import that palette in. And the palettes, once again, are in the root folder of your Harmony scene. Then below is the color list. So if you choose a different palette, you can see that the colors are listed below. And of course, both of these two windows are collapsible if you'd like to do that. So let's take a look at the first section on the right side, and that's the palette override. So the superhero palette is the dominant palette for our scene because it was the first one created for our superhero character. However, what if we wanted the darker palette that was modeled off the original palette to be the dominant palette for this scene? So in other words, for the superhero character to be rendered in this scene with those darker colors. So what we could do to make this happen is to grab the superhero palette dark from the palette section and drag and drop it into the color override section. And now, as you can see, it takes precedence over the superhero palette, which is why all of a sudden our character turned dark in the camera view. So I'm just going to click that and delete it. Then if we take a look at the color override section, what we could do with this section is drag in a specific color and then manipulate it in a different way. So let's go back to the superhero palette. Then from the superhero palette, let's grab the gloves color, which is also the color of the torso here, and drag it into the color override section. Then under the mode section, let's click where it says new RGBA to bring up the menu, and let's select color not visible. Immediately you can see in the camera view that anything that was painted with this gloves color then becomes transparent or not visible. So that, for example, is something you can do with the color override effect. So let's delete that, and this time let's select the pant color and drag and drop it into the color override section. And this time from the texture file name, let's click just beneath on the words not used, and that brings up the texture file browser window. So from that browser window, I'm going to select the Galaxy TGA file, and you can once again select either TGA or PSD files, and then I'm going to click on the open button, And the reason that we can't see anything is twofold. First of all, we need to change the mode. So I'm going to click once again on the new RGBA to bring up the mode menu. And this time I'm going to select something like Texture Original Matrix or one of the texture options. Then what I'm going to do is click on the render mode. So now as you can see, that galaxy texture fills in any place where the pant swatch had filled in color. And once again, I'm just going to click on this and then delete it. So let's go back to the OpenGL view, and actually I'm also going to close the layer properties because to show you the next section, selected colors, I want to navigate somewhere different in the network view. So let's go into the master group, and then let's go back into the head group, and then once again into the facial features, and once again into the left eye. So if you remember, we had a network system here to make the eye cutter effect work. So let's zoom in on the face again so we can see how this effect will work. Okay, so you may have wondered why we didn't just use the original eye drawing as the mat in the cutter, which is very possible. And maybe you didn't want to do this because one of the obvious reasons is that then we would have to modify the original white of the eye as having no black outline. But with the color override, we can actually eliminate the black outline for the mat so that the mat really is only the white part. So what I'm going to do here is go back into the module library, find the color override one more time. So just for now, I'm going to get rid of this eye mat. And I'm going to disable it by clicking on the keyboard shortcut D. And then I'm going to take a wire from the eye layer, put it into the color override, connect the color override to the cutter, and as well connect the green port of the color override to the eye peg. Then I'm going to click on the little yellow box to bring up its tool properties. I'm going to go back to the superhero palette. I'm going to scroll down and select the eyelid, which I know is what we use to fill in the whites of the eye. I'm going to drag and drop it into the selected color section, and then I'm going to click on the render selected colors option. So then let's close. And now if we select the transform tool, we can select the pupil again and move it upwards. And you can see that it functions just as well as having an eye mat. You know, it disappears when you move it upwards as well as downwards to make the character look like he's either looking up or down. So that once again is another option that you have to combine the cutter effect with the color override effect. So that's it for the tutorial how to add effects. Stay tuned for the next tutorial, how to export a movie.